Nobody on Maple Creek Road paid much attention to Maya Johnson. Not because she was invisible, she was far from it. She was 12 years old, sharp as a tack, with deep brown eyes that caught every flicker of life around her. Braids so neat they looked sewn by a machine, and a laugh loud enough to rattle the old storm windows in her grandmother's house. But on that particular street in Clarkton, Georgia, in the long summer of 2009, people were mostly caught up in their own survival. The recession had chewed through the neighborhood like a slow fire. Factories shuttered, fathers gone, mothers working double shifts. Children like Maya were expected to be quiet, stay out of trouble, and be grateful for what little was left. Maya did all of those things. But she did one more thing too, one thing nobody asked her to do, one thing she chose entirely on her own. Every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m., before the heat of the Georgia sun climbed high enough to make the sidewalk sizzle, Maya would slip out of her grandmother's house with a paper bag in her hand and walk 4 houses down to the small gray bungalow at the end of the cul-de-sac. The house had a sagging porch, a mailbox that leaned like it was tired, and curtains so thick no light could get through. Most people on the street didn't even know who lived there. The neighbors assumed it was some grumpy old recluse. The kids called it the dead house. Nobody knocked on that door. Maya knocked every single morning. The man who lived inside was named Walter Hayes, 74 years old. White hair, brown skin that had weathered decades of hard sun. Hands so rough they looked carved from old wood. He walked with a cane because of an injury he never talked about, and he had a way of looking at you, straight through you like he was sizing up something deeper than your face. He didn't smile easily. He didn't talk much. The first morning Maya knocked on his door, 3 months earlier, he had opened it and stared at her for a long, silent moment before saying, in a voice like gravel on a tin roof, "What do you want?" Maya held up the brown bag. "Breakfast," she said simply. "My grandma made biscuits and I made the eggs. We thought you might want some." He stared at her. She stared back. Neither of them blinked for what felt like a very long time. "I don't need charity," he said. "It's not charity," Maya said. "Grandma made too many biscuits. They'll just get hard." He looked at the bag. He looked at her. Something shifted in those steady old eyes. A tiny crack in a very thick wall. He took the bag, said nothing, and closed the door. Maya stood on the porch for a moment, then walked home. She didn't know why she came back the next morning. She just did. By the second week, he was opening the door before she even knocked. By the third week, he started saying good morning before she could speak. By the end of the first month, he started leaving his door cracked, just barely, as if to say, "I know you're coming. It's okay." Maya told her grandmother about it in the careful way kids tell adults things they're not sure will be understood. Her grandmother, a stout woman named Evelyn who wore house slippers until noon and believed that feeding people was the same as loving them, listened quietly and then said, "You keep going, baby. That man needs it more than he lets on." So Maya kept going. What she didn't tell her grandmother, what she didn't tell anyone, was that it wasn't entirely about Walter. It was partly about herself. Because the truth was, Maya was lonely too. Her father had left when she was 6. Her mother worked nights at the hospital and slept days. Her best friend from elementary school had moved to Atlanta the previous spring. School was out for summer. The neighborhood was quiet in that specific, hollow way that only becomes clear when you're a child with nowhere particular to be and nobody particularly waiting for you. Walter Hayes never talked much on those early mornings, but he was always there, and somehow the steady fact of him, the predictability of that cracked door, that gravel voice, that rough hand reaching for the bag, was something Maya found herself needing in a way she couldn't quite name. By midsummer, the breakfasts had expanded. It wasn't just biscuits and eggs anymore. Some mornings it was oatmeal with brown sugar the way Maya's grandmother made it. Some mornings it was toast with the blackberry jam they put up every June in old mason jars that lined the kitchen shelf like stained glass. Once, Maya brought a small thermos of coffee because she'd overheard Walter muttering that he'd run out of grounds. He accepted it without a word but held it with both hands like something precious. On the 63rd morning, Maya kept count in a small purple notebook she kept on her nightstand. Walter Hayes opened the door wider than usual. Enough to show that the inside of his house was dim but not dirty, cluttered but not chaotic. There were stacks of books everywhere, photographs on the walls, a large American flag, folded into a precise triangle, sitting inside a glass case on the mantelpiece. Maya's eyes went to the flag immediately. "What's that for?" she asked. Walter looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the flag. "That," he said slowly, "is a long story." "I got time," Maya said. She held up his bag. "And I brought extra biscuits." For the first time, the very first time in 63 mornings, Walter Hayes smiled. It wasn't a big smile. More of a crack in stone than a bloom of something soft. But it was real. And it changed the whole morning, the way a single match can change a very dark room. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "I'll tell you then." Maya went home with a feeling she could not name, warm and electric and slightly nervous. And the next morning, at exactly 7:15, she knocked on the door for the 64th time, with extra biscuits and a notebook and every ounce of attention a 12-year-old could summon. What she was about to learn would change both of their lives forever. The 64th morning was different from every morning before it. Not in the weather. The Georgia heat was already pressing down before 7. The air thick with the smell of wet grass and gasoline. But in the way Walter Hayes held himself when he opened the door. He was dressed more carefully than usual. Clean shirt, pressed slacks, the cane held at his side like a scepter rather than a crutch. He had combed his white hair. He had, Maya realized with a small shock, been waiting for her. He led her inside for the first time. The living room was smaller than she'd imagined and larger in meaning than any room she'd ever stood in. Books were stacked on every surface. History books, mostly, their spines cracked and worn, some with scraps of paper sticking out like pale tongues. Photographs covered one entire wall. Black and white images, color photos faded to pastels, framed and hung with evident care. In many of them, Maya could see a younger Walter Hayes in uniform, a military uniform she couldn't name but recognized as important by the weight it seemed to carry even in a photograph. And then there was the flag. Up close, inside its glass triangle case on the mantelpiece, it was even more striking. The red, white, and blue had the deep, serious color of something that had lived through things. Maya sat in the chair Walter pointed to, an old armchair with doilies on the armrests and a worn patch on the cushion from decades of use. Walter lowered himself into his own chair with the careful, methodical movement of a man who had learned to respect his own pain. He looked at her for a moment. Then he began. "I grew up in Alabama," he said. "Not far from Birmingham. You know what Birmingham was?" Maya nodded slowly. She knew enough. "I joined the army in 1953, Walter continued. "I was 18 years old and I had two reasons. First, I wanted to be something more than what that town was willing to let me be. Second, I believed in something. Don't ask me to explain that exactly. When you're young, belief is sometimes a feeling before it's a reason." He had served in Korea, he told her, arriving just as the armistice was signed. Late for the fighting but early enough to see the aftermath. Then he stayed in the military. Made it a career. Vietnam came and he went twice. He said the word Vietnam with a particular flatness, like a man pressing a scar rather than a wound, aware of the pain but choosing not to flinch from it. He was awarded 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He showed her the medals from a small wooden box. Maya held the Purple Heart in her palm and felt the strange, serious weight of it. Not heavy exactly, but significant, the way certain objects carry history in their metal. "This one," Walter said quietly, touching the edge of the Purple Heart, "means I bled for this country. What it doesn't say, what no medal ever says, is whether this country bled for me." Maya didn't speak. She wasn't sure words were what was needed. He had come back from his second tour in 1971 and found a country deeply divided about the war he'd just fought. He had worn his uniform on the plane home and a woman had spit on him in the airport. He said this without anger, with a kind of archaeological distance, like describing something found in a dig, not something that happened to him. But Maya saw his hand tighten on the arm of his chair. He married a woman named Constance in 1974. He said her name differently than he said anything else. Softer, slower, as if the word itself needed to be handled with care. They had one son, Marcus, born in 1977. Constance was the one who kept the home, kept Marcus grounded, kept Walter from disappearing entirely into the military life that had become his whole identity. In 1998, Constance was diagnosed with cancer. She died in 2001, 7 weeks after September 11th. Walter said that losing her in the same season the country was torn open felt like the world ending in two directions at once. Marcus grew up, went to college in North Carolina, built a life of his own. He called on birthdays and holidays. But Walter was a man who had always been defined by service, by structure, by mission, and in retirement, without any of those things, without Constance, in a small gray house at the end of a cul-de-sac where no one knocked on the door, he had become something he never expected to become. Lonely. He said the word plainly, without apology, which made it land harder than if he had dressed it in sentiment. "I don't say that for your pity," Walter told Maya. "I say it because it's the truth, and I have spent my whole life believing that the truth is worth saying out loud, even when it doesn't make you look good." September came in quietly, the way it does in the South. Not with a dramatic shift in temperature but with a softening of the light, a slight cooling of the afternoons, the first whisper of color in the edges of the leaves. Maya started 7th grade. The school bus came at 7:45, which meant she had to move faster. But she still made it to Walter's door by 7:15. She had simply started getting up 20 minutes earlier. Her school year brought new energy in ways that surprised her. Something had shifted over the summer, a confidence her teachers noticed immediately. Her language arts teacher, Mrs. Patterson, pulled her aside after the second week to compliment an essay Maya had written about a person who changed my thinking. Maya had written about Walter without using his name, calling him simply the veteran on my street. When she told Walter about this the next morning, he was quiet. Then he said, "What did you write?" She read him the excerpt from memory. She'd memorized it the way she memorized things she cared about. She told him she'd written about the way he talked about history not as a series of events but as a series of choices made by actual human beings who were afraid and uncertain and trying their best. When she finished, Walter was quiet for a full minute. "That's a better education than most people get," he finally said. "Keep writing." October brought the first real cold snap. Maya started adding hand warmers to the breakfast bag. Walter began leaving a pair of gloves on the porch railing for her to wear on the walk back. They were small gardening gloves, worn thin, in a faded floral pattern that was clearly Constance's. Maya wore them every cold morning without remark, understanding without being told that this was significant, that it required no comment from either of them. November came, and with it, Walter's health began to change. Maya noticed it in small ways. He moved more slowly. Some mornings he was already seated at the kitchen table when she arrived. He coughed more. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee mug. Once, he forgot a word mid-sentence, just an ordinary word, and the look on his face was not frustration but something closer to grief, as if he recognized this as the beginning of a particular kind of loss. She called his son Marcus for the first time in November, using a number she had found inside the cover of a book Walter had lent her with the inscription, "If you ever need something and I can't be reached, Marcus, 919-555-0147. She suspected Walter had put it there intentionally. Marcus answered on the second ring, warm and immediately concerned. "I'll come down next weekend," he said. "He won't ask you to," Maya said. "I know," said Marcus. "That's why I'm telling you, not him." Marcus came. Maya stayed away that Saturday, the first morning since June she hadn't knocked on Walter's door. It felt wrong in a specific physical way, like a tooth missing from her morning. She watched Marcus's rental car in the driveway and felt relieved and worried at the same time, which was a combination she was beginning to understand was just part of loving people. After Marcus left, Walter called to Maya from his porch when she was walking back from the corner store. "Thank you," he said simply. She pretended not to know what he meant. He pretended to believe her. The last morning before everything changed was an ordinary Tuesday in December. Cold but bright. Maya brought oatmeal in a thermos, toast wrapped in foil, and a small container of her grandmother's blackberry jam. Walter was in good spirits, sharper than he'd been in weeks. They played chess. He beat her in 17 moves. She demanded a rematch and he laughed. Really laughed, from somewhere low and genuine, and set up the pieces again. She lost again in 14 moves. "You're letting me win the second time faster than the first," she said. "I'm efficient," he said. "It's a military virtue." She walked home that morning with her hood up against the December chill, laughing to herself on the sidewalk. She didn't know it was the last ordinary morning. She couldn't have known. But she would think about it later. The chess, the laughter, the jam, the particular quality of winter light through his kitchen window. And she would be glad it was what it was. Just a good morning, clean and complete. 3 days later, the military officers came to her door. Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why did you take the breakfast?" That first morning. Walter looked at her with those steady, deep-set eyes. He almost smiled again. "Because," he said, "you looked like someone who needed to give it as much as I needed to receive it." Summer became a rhythm. Maya would knock at 7:15. Walter would open the door, wider each time, as if the house itself was slowly exhaling. She would bring whatever breakfast her grandmother had made. They started eating together at the kitchen table, a progression so gradual neither of them acknowledged it directly. Walter taught her things, not as performance, not working toward a grade, but in the way people teach when they simply cannot help sharing what they know. He taught her to read a map by landmark and compass bearing. He taught her 3 chess openings and beat her so thoroughly the first 6 times that she stopped counting and started paying closer attention. He told her about the civil rights movement not from a textbook angle but from a street-level one. The names of people he had personally known, the texture of fear and defiance that lived side by side in those years, the internal debates that history books tended to smooth over. He talked to her like she was a person fully capable of handling difficult truth. In a summer when most adults in her life were either absent or exhausted, this was a gift so large she couldn't see its edges. In return, Maya gave him things too. She was funny in the quick, self-aware way of children who have spent more time with adults than with their peers. She asked questions that stopped him cold. Not naive questions but precise ones, the kind that required him to actually think rather than recite. She told him about her life with a directness that matched his own, about missing her father, about her mother's exhaustion, about the specific loneliness of being the kid who reads too much and doesn't quite fit the cliques that had already hardened by middle school. He listened to all of it the way a soldier listens to a report from the field, fully, carefully, weighing every detail. "You remind me of Constance," he told her one morning. "Not in the way you look, in the way you pay attention to things." This was, Maya understood without being told, the highest compliment he knew how to give. Her grandmother noticed the change in Maya before Maya did. "You're standing up straighter," Evelyn observed one evening. "And you've been reading at night again. I can see the light under your door." "Mr. Walter lends me books," Maya said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. "Just that. Good." By August, Walter had shown Maya every photograph on the wall and told her the story behind each one. There was his unit in Korea, 22 men arranged in 2 rows, all of them younger than Maya could quite believe. There was his wedding photo, Constance in a white dress that showed a woman of electric elegance and determination. There was Marcus at his college graduation, both of them grinning in a way that made Maya's chest ache with tenderness. And there was one photograph at the far end of the wall that Walter always passed over without comment. Maya noticed but didn't ask. She had developed, over those weeks, a sensitive radar for the silences that meant not yet and the silences that meant never. This one was not yet. Near the end of August, on an overcast Tuesday when the heat had finally broken, Walter walked to that photograph himself. He lifted it off the nail and brought it to the table. It showed 5 soldiers, all young, all in desert camouflage, more recent than Vietnam, more recent than Korea. Walter was not in this photograph, but he was holding it the way you hold photographs of people you have lost. "These were my men," he said quietly. "Last unit I commanded before I retired. They deployed to Iraq 6 months after I left service." He set the photograph on the table between them. Maya looked at the 5 faces. Young men grinning at the camera with the aggressive, slightly reckless cheerfulness of people trying not to think about what was ahead of them. 3 of them came back, Walter said. The silence that followed was of the kind that does not ask to be filled. After a long moment, Maya reached across the table and placed her hand over Walter's rough, carved wood hand. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. Walter looked down at her small hand on his, and for a moment his face did something complicated and private that Maya looked away from, giving him the dignity of feeling it without an audience. She walked home more slowly than usual that morning, thinking about all the things people carry that no medal commemorates and no photograph fully captures. September came in quietly, the way it does in the South. Not with a dramatic shift in temperature but with a softening of the light, a slight cooling of the afternoons, the first whisper of color in the edges of the leaves. Maya started 7th grade. The school bus came at 7:45, which meant she had to move faster. But she still made it to Walter's door by 7:15. She had simply started getting up 20 minutes earlier. Her school year brought new energy in ways that surprised her. Something had shifted over the summer, a confidence her teachers noticed immediately. Her language arts teacher, Mrs. Patterson, pulled her aside after the second week to compliment an essay Maya had written about a person who changed my thinking. Maya had written about Walter without using his name, calling him simply the veteran on my street. When she told Walter about this the next morning, he was quiet. Then he said, "What did you write?" She read him the excerpt from memory. She'd memorized it the way she memorized things she cared about. She told him she'd written about the way he talked about history not as a series of events but as a series of choices made by actual human beings who were afraid and uncertain and trying their best. When she finished, Walter was quiet for a full minute. "That's a better education than most people get," he finally said. "Keep writing." October brought the first real cold snap. Maya started adding hand warmers to the breakfast bag. Walter began leaving a pair of gloves on the porch railing for her to wear on the walk back. They were small gardening gloves, worn thin, in a faded floral pattern that was clearly Constance's. Maya wore them every cold morning without remark, understanding without being told that this was significant, that it required no comment from either of them. November came, and with it, Walter's health began to change. Maya noticed it in small ways. He moved more slowly. Some mornings he was already seated at the kitchen table when she arrived. He coughed more. His hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee mug. Once, he forgot a word mid-sentence, just an ordinary word, and the look on his face was not frustration but something closer to grief, as if he recognized this as the beginning of a particular kind of loss. She called his son Marcus for the first time in November, using a number she had found inside the cover of a book Walter had lent her with the inscription, "If you ever need something and I can't be reached, Marcus, 919-555-0147. She suspected Walter had put it there intentionally. Marcus answered on the second ring, warm and immediately concerned. "I'll come down next weekend," he said. "He won't ask you to," Maya said. "I know," said Marcus. "That's why I'm telling you, not him." Marcus came. Maya stayed away that Saturday. The first morning since June she hadn't knocked on Walter's door. It felt wrong in a specific physical way, like a tooth missing from her morning. She watched Marcus's rental car in the driveway and felt relieved and worried at the same time, which was a combination she was beginning to understand was just part of loving people. After Marcus left, Walter called to Maya from his porch when she was walking back from the corner store. "Thank you," he said simply. She pretended not to know what he meant. He pretended to believe her. The last morning before everything changed was an ordinary Tuesday in December. Cold but bright. Maya brought oatmeal in a thermos, toast wrapped in foil, and a small container of her grandmother's blackberry jam. Walter was in good spirits, sharper than he'd been in weeks. They played chess. He beat her in 17 moves. She demanded a rematch and he laughed. Really laughed from somewhere low and genuine, and set up the pieces again. She lost again in 14 moves. "You're letting me win the second time faster than the first," she said. "I'm efficient," he said. "It's a military virtue." She walked home that morning with her hood up against the December chill, laughing to herself on the sidewalk. She didn't know it was the last ordinary morning. She couldn't have known. But she would think about it later. The chess, the laughter, the jam, the particular quality of winter light through his kitchen window. And she would be glad it was what it was. Just a good morning, clean and complete. 3 days later, the military officers came to her door. It was a Friday afternoon in December, just after 3 o'clock, when Maya came home from school to find 2 United States Army officers standing on her grandmother's porch. They were in full dress uniform, dark green, gold buttons, the kind of formality you only see at funerals and ceremonies. One was a tall man with a captain's bars. The other was a woman, a lieutenant, with close-cropped hair and an expression of practiced, careful kindness. Between them, her grandmother stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest, the other holding the door frame. Maya stopped dead on the sidewalk. The first thought that crashed through her, instant, violent, nauseating, was that something had happened to her mother. She stood on the sidewalk and felt the world tip sideways for a terrible 3 seconds. Then the captain stepped forward and said, gently but clearly, "Maya Johnson?" She nodded, unable to speak. "My name is Captain David Reese. This is Lieutenant Amanda Torres. We're from the United States Army. We'd like to speak with you, if we may." They all went inside. The officers sat on the couch, Maya and her grandmother in the chairs they always sat in, the room suddenly feeling smaller than it ever had before. Captain Reese spoke carefully and with obvious respect. Walter Hayes, he said, had passed away 3 days ago, Wednesday morning at home in his sleep. He was 74 years old. His son Marcus had been notified first and had handled the immediate arrangements. But the officers were here because Walter, in the final revision of his will made just 6 weeks earlier, had included a specific provision, a specific request that required their presence. Maya sat very still. She was aware of her grandmother's hand tightening around hers. She was aware of the winter light making rectangles on the floor. She was doing the thing she sometimes did when things were too big, cataloging the small details of the room as a way of staying inside it. Walter Hayes was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1969, Captain Reese continued. He received 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. He served this country with distinction for 22 years, including 2 tours in Vietnam. He is being honored with a full military funeral, with burial at Arlington National Cemetery next Thursday. He paused. Mr. Hayes's final will included a handwritten letter, personal letter, addressed to you. He reached into a leather portfolio and produced an envelope. It was sealed with old tape, yellowed slightly, which told Maya he had sealed it some time ago. Her name was written on the front in Walter's handwriting, the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man trained to write for legibility above all else. The letters were square and even and somehow very much like him. Lieutenant Torres spoke for the first time. "You don't have to open it right now. That's yours, and yours alone, whenever you're ready." Maya held the envelope with both hands. It was heavier than it should have been, not in weight but in the way objects become heavy when you understand what they contain. "There is also a second matter," Captain Reese said. "Mr. Hayes has requested that you, specifically, be present at the burial ceremony at Arlington. Your grandmother is also invited. All arrangements, travel, accommodations, everything, will be handled." Before he turned to go, Captain Reese paused and said, quietly, "I want you to know, Maya, Sergeant Hayes talked about you. He had a standing call with our Veterans Outreach Program. He mentioned you often. He said you reminded him why service was worth the cost." Maya's grandmother thanked them. Maya couldn't speak. She walked them to the door and stood on the porch and watched them walk down the path to the street, their dress uniforms very dark against the gray December afternoon, their footsteps precise and even on the concrete. When they were gone, she sat down on the porch steps, the same steps she had sat on during those early weeks before Walter started letting her inside, and she held the letter in both hands and looked at her name written in his square, careful letters, and she cried. Quietly, without drama, the way people cry when they are not performing grief but are simply inside it. Her grandmother sat down beside her and said nothing. She had brought, from nowhere, Constance's old floral gloves. She placed them gently in Maya's lap. They sat together on the porch until the light faded and the street lamps came on and the cold deepened, and neither of them moved to go inside. Maya read the letter that night. She sat on her bed with it in her lap for a long time before opening it. The lamp was on. The purple notebook was open on the desk. She'd pulled it out and then not written anything, just left it open as a kind of preparation. She opened the envelope carefully, peeling the old tape back without tearing anything. Inside were 3 pages written in that same careful hand. Dear Maya, it began. I am writing this in October, which means by the time you read it I'll have been gone for some time. I'm sorry for that. I would have preferred to say what I have to say out loud, but some things are clearer on paper, and I have always been better at discipline than at softness. Bear with me. He wrote about the summer. Not sentimentally but specifically. He remembered the day she told him about her father leaving. He remembered the morning she brought sweet potato pie, slightly scorched on one edge, and apologized, and he told her not to apologize, that food made with effort doesn't need to apologize for itself. He remembered the chess games. He remembered the day she held his hand when he showed her the photograph of his fallen men. You did something for me that I am not certain I could have done for myself. You made me re-enter the world. I had been out of it for years, not physically, but in every way that matters. When Constance died, I put up walls. I told myself it was because I was a private man and a soldier and that solitude was my right. The truth was that I was afraid. Not of enemies or danger. I had made my peace with those things long ago. I was afraid of matching to someone again. Because matching means loss is possible, and I had already lost so much that the arithmetic of it seemed incompatible with survival. You knocked on my door. You kept knocking. And eventually I understood that you were not going to stop, and that refusing you was going to require more effort than accepting you. And then something happened that I had not planned for. I stopped being afraid. Maya pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She kept reading. He wrote about what he was leaving her. He had set aside a fund, a modest but real sum, administered through Marcus, for Maya's education. Not a fortune, he was clear about that, but enough to help significantly when the time came for college. He had also left her his entire library, every book on those shelves, to be delivered when she wanted them. And he had left her the glass case with the folded flag, with this instruction written in the will, to be given to Maya Johnson, who taught an old soldier that the best reason to have served is so that children like her can have lives worth living. Maya had to stop reading. She set the letter down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed slowly and deliberately. Just breathing, just being in the body, just staying present in the physical reality of the room. After a few minutes, she picked it up and continued. The last page was shorter. His handwriting was slightly less controlled. She could see where the pen had trembled, but the words were as direct as anything else he had ever said. I want to tell you something about yourself that you should know, because nobody else may say it clearly enough. You are the kind of person this country is actually built on. Not the monuments, not the speeches, not the men like me who go to war and come home with medals and injuries and long silences. The country is built on the quiet, daily acts of people who choose to show up for someone who needs it. Not because they are required to, not because they will be noticed or rewarded, but because they understand at some level deeper than instruction that human beings need each other and that this need, honored daily in small ways, is what holds the whole structure together. You brought me breakfast. You sat at my table. You listened. You did not pity me, and you did not fear me, and you did not treat me as a curiosity or a project. You treated me as a person. That is harder than it sounds and more important than most people understand. Go to Arlington next Thursday. Let them honor me the way soldiers are honored. But know that the honor I am most proud of has nothing to do with medals or ceremonies. It has to do with a brown paper bag at my door at 7:15 on a summer morning, and a girl who decided, for no particular reason except that it was the right thing to do, to keep coming back. Your friend, Walter Hayes. Maya closed the letter. She placed it on her nightstand beside the purple notebook. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark for a long time, not sleeping, just holding everything, the grief and the gratitude and the immensity of having been truly known by someone, until finally sleep came and took her under gently. Like a tide, Maya had never been to Washington, D.C. She had seen it in books and on television, but she had never stood inside it, never felt the particular weight of a city built to be the physical expression of a nation's idea of itself. She noticed, riding in from the airport in the car Marcus had sent, that the city was grander and colder than she'd imagined. The monuments broader, the streets wider, the winter sky a flat gray that pressed down on everything and made the white marble of the buildings look like bone. Marcus met them at the hotel. He was in his late 30s, with his father's eyes and a quieter version of his father's direct manner. He embraced Maya's grandmother warmly and then turned to Maya with an expression she had not expected. Not the polite gratitude of an obligation being discharged, but something genuine, something almost relieved. "He talked about you for months," Marcus said. "Every time we spoke, you were always the first thing he mentioned." They had dinner together that evening, Marcus, his wife Diane, and their 2 children, ages 8 and 10. The 8-year-old, Zoe, sat next to Maya at dinner and asked 17 questions in a row about Georgia, chess, and superheroes. Maya answered each one patiently and in full. That night in the hotel, Maya's grandmother sat on the edge of the bed and held Maya's hand. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you," she said. "Grandpa Walter?" Maya said, and then caught herself. She had never called him that. The name had just arrived, naturally, without planning. Her grandmother looked at her for a moment and something passed over her face that Maya could not fully read. "Walter Hayes," her grandmother said quietly. "Yes." The ceremony at Arlington was on a Thursday morning, cold and overcast, the bare trees of the cemetery standing like dark sentinels against the winter sky. Arlington in December is a place that makes you understand, physically, in your bones, what the word solemn means. The rows of white headstones extending in every direction across the hills, each one a life, each one a story, the totality of it impossible to absorb. 20 or 30 people gathered. Colleagues from Walter's years of service. Fellow veterans, some using canes or wheelchairs, all carrying themselves with the upright dignity of people who have chosen, consciously, to honor the occasion with their posture. Captain Reese in full dress uniform, Lieutenant Torres, Marcus and his family, and Maya, in a dark blue coat her grandmother had taken her to buy the previous weekend, standing in the cold with her hands in Constance's gloves, still wearing them, still finding them important, and her purple notebook in her coat pocket. The ceremony was precise and beautiful in the way military ceremony is. Not warm exactly, but deeply intentional, every movement the result of decades of refinement in service of a single purpose, to honor with full seriousness the life that has been given. The honor guard in their immaculate uniforms. The rifle salute, the sound of it cracking across the winter air. Taps, played by a single bugler, the notes rising and falling with a simple gravity that stripped everything non-essential away. When the flag was folded 7 folds, then more, the white stars visible at the final triangle. Maya watched with total attention. The soldiers' hands were gloved and precise. The flag moved with ceremonial authority. She understood now why Walter had kept his own flag in a glass case on the mantelpiece. Captain Reese carried the folded flag to Marcus, kneeling before him, speaking the traditional words. Marcus accepted it with his jaw set and his eyes bright. Then, not standard protocol, something Marcus had specifically arranged, Captain Reese walked to Maya. He knelt before her on the cold ground in his full dress uniform, holding a second folded flag that had been specifically prepared for this purpose. He looked up at her with the steady, serious expression of a man performing an act he has thought carefully about and chosen to mean. "Sergeant Hayes left specific instructions," Captain Reese said quietly, "that a flag be presented to you. He wrote in his own hand that you were the best kind of soldier this country has. The kind who serves without being asked. The kind who shows up every day." Maya took the flag. She held it against her chest, in her gloved hands, standing in the cold of Arlington in December with the rows of white headstones stretching away in every direction. She looked out at the winter sky above the cemetery and understood something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find the right words for. That the smallest acts of human kindness travel farther and last longer than any of us can see from where we're standing. The flag from Arlington sat in its glass case on Maya's dresser for the next 6 years, through the rest of middle school and all of high school, through every version of herself she cycled through during those years of growth. The flag was the fixed point in all that flux. Walter's books arrived in 3 large cardboard boxes 6 months after Arlington. Maya unpacked them herself over an entire afternoon, handling each one with care, reading the inscriptions Walter had written in some of them. Neat notes in pencil on the title pages, dates of reading, occasional marginal comments in that familiar square handwriting. She organized them on 2 shelves above her desk. They stayed there through high school, consulted regularly, argued with occasionally in her mind, always present. The education fund Walter left was enough to cover 2 years at a state university. Combined with a merit scholarship her language arts essays helped her win. Mrs. Patterson wrote a recommendation letter that was, by Maya's later account, the best piece of writing produced by anyone in connection with her application, and financial aid, it was enough. More than enough. She studied political science and history at the University of Georgia. She wrote her undergraduate thesis on the experiences of Black Vietnam veterans, the double displacement of soldiers who returned from a controversial war into a country still fighting its own civil rights battles. She dedicated the thesis to Walter Hayes, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, 1953 to 2009. Her thesis advisor, who had been studying veterans' issues for 30 years, called it the best undergraduate thesis he had read in a decade. She told him she had good source material. She went to law school. She specialized in veterans benefits law, the dense, complex, often infuriating machinery through which veterans and their families attempt to receive the care and compensation they are owed. She had chosen this area specifically because she had come to understand that the gap between what this country promises its veterans and what it actually delivers is wide enough to swallow people whole. Particularly veterans of color, particularly those without advocates, particularly those who, like Walter in his later years, had retreated behind thick curtains and didn't know how to ask for help. She was 31 when she won her first landmark case. A class action suit on behalf of a group of Black Vietnam veterans whose benefit claims had been systematically undervalued for decades. The settlement was significant. The precedent was more significant. Marcus Hayes, who had stayed in touch through all those years, calling on her birthday, attending her law school commencement with Diane and the kids, sent her a card with 2 words written inside. He knew. Maya kept that card in the glass case with the flag. She married at 33. Her husband was a high school history teacher named James who had, she told people when they asked how they met, the important quality of actually listening when someone was talking, which she had learned to recognize early as rarer and more valuable than it sounds. They had a daughter in 2027 and named her Constance. Little Constance grew up in a house where a glass case with a folded flag sat on a shelf in the study, where 2 shelves of old, carefully kept books lined the wall above a desk, where a purple notebook, the original, its pages filled with a 12-year-old's handwriting, was kept in a locked wooden box that her mother sometimes took out and read from, always alone, always quietly. When Constance was 8 years old, she asked her mother about the flag. Maya sat down with her and told her the story, the whole story from the beginning. The summer, the brown bag, the biscuits, the chess, the medals, the photographs, the officers at the door, the letter, Arlington in December. She told it the way Walter had taught her to tell things. Directly, with respect for the listener's ability to handle the truth. Constance listened with the focused, quiet attention of a child who has been raised to understand that listening is a skill and a gift. When Maya finished, Constance was quiet for a moment. "He was your Grandpa Walter," she said. "He was. And the gloves were Grandma Constance's." "Yes. And you named me after her." "I did." Constance looked at the glass case for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, if there's an old person on our street who doesn't have anybody, can we bring them breakfast?" Maya looked at her daughter, 8 years old, with deep brown eyes that caught every flicker of life around her and a laugh loud enough to rattle old windows, and felt something move through her that had no exact name but lived in the same territory as gratitude and wonder and the particular, irreducible love that exists between the people we become and the people who helped us become them. "Yes," Maya said, "we can." The next morning at 7:15, Maya and Constance walked 4 houses down the street with a brown paper bag between them. Inside, biscuits, fresh eggs, and a small thermos of strong, black coffee. They knocked. Someone opened the door. And a new story began, the way every real story begins. Not with a grand gesture or a turning point or a moment anyone would recognize as significant from the outside, but with one person showing up, consistently, for another person who needed it. That quiet knock, that offered bag, that daily choice to say, in the plainest possible language, I see you. You are not alone. I am here. Which is, when you take away all the ceremony and the medals and the monuments and the glass cases, what we owe each other. All of us, every day, on every street, in every neighborhood, in every corner of this complicated, imperfect, still worth fighting for country we share. The end,